Somewhere over the Indian Ocean right now, a formation of B-2 Spirit bombers is either landing or taking off from a runway most people couldn't find on a map. Somewhere over Europe, a chain of aerial refueling tankers is stacked at altitude, holding position, waiting to top off fighters that are already burning fuel toward the Persian Gulf. And somewhere in a briefing room in Washington, a decision is reportedly close. Not a threat, not a talking point for a press conference. A decision. That's the word being used. And when the word decision starts replacing the word option, that's usually the moment things stop being theoretical. But let's back all the way up, because to understand what's unfolding right now, you need to understand what has been building for months, and in some ways, for years. This war didn't start last week. It started on February 28th, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched a coordinated opening strike against Iran that did something almost no one expected. It didn't just hit missile sites or radar installations. It removed Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, from the equation entirely. That single strike sent the region into a different kind of conflict than anyone had modeled. It triggered a torrent of retaliation, hundreds of ballistic missiles, thousands of drones launched across the region in the days that followed. That was the opening chapter. What's happening right now is not a new war. It's the same war, reignited, after a ceasefire that was never as solid as it looked on paper. In June of 2026, a memorandum of understanding was reached. On paper, it was supposed to end the conflict, reopen the Strait of Hormuz to normal shipping traffic, and prevent Iran from ever reconstituting a nuclear weapons program. President Trump called it, at the time, an agreement that achieved everything the United States set out to accomplish. Those were his words. But an agreement is only as strong as the willingness of both sides to actually honor it. And this one didn't hold. By late June, cracks were already showing. And by July 6th and 7th, those cracks became a rupture. Iranian forces attacked commercial vessels, and within days, the ceasefire that had been sold to the public as a lasting peace was, in Trump's own words, essentially meaningless. He didn't hedge on it either. He compared a memorandum of understanding with the regime he distrusts to a handshake with, in his words, sleazebags. He said it plainly. It doesn't mean much when you're dealing with people who don't intend to keep their word. And he said it doesn't always mean much, even with honorable people. That's not diplomatic language. That's the language of someone who has already decided the diplomatic phase is over. And once that phase ends, what replaces it is the phase we're in right now. A nightly bombing campaign that has run for more than 2 weeks straight, expanding not just in frequency, but in scope, in target selection, and in the sheer volume of hardware being pushed into the theater to sustain it. Here's where things stand as of today, using the most recent confirmed reporting available. United States Central Command has been conducting consecutive nightly strikes against Iranian targets since strikes resumed in early July, with the campaign now stretching well past its second week. Iranian officials say the toll from this renewed round of hostilities has already climbed past several dozen killed and hundreds wounded, including women and children, since the ceasefire began fraying in late June. On the American side, casualties have also started mounting. Multiple U.S. service members have been killed, the first American military fatalities from Iranian fire since earlier this year, and close to 100 more have suffered injuries, most described as minor, since the current wave of strikes began. One American service member remains listed as missing in action. Read that again, because it matters. This is no longer a campaign being fought at arm's length, where the cost is absorbed entirely by the other side. Americans are dying in this conflict now. That single fact changes the political center of gravity in Washington completely, because a war where the American public sees flag-draped coffins is a war that generates pressure to finish, not to manage. The targeting itself tells its own story. In the most recent nights of strikes, U.S. aircraft have expanded beyond the early target set of coastal defenses and missile storage sites. Reports describe military command centers, communication networks, drone storage facilities, and maritime surveillance installations, all being folded into the target list. Iranian state media has reported explosions in Bandar Abbas, on the island of Keshem, and across Hormozgan province along the Gulf of Oman, all areas that sit directly along the choke points Iran depends on to project power into the Strait of Hormuz. This is not scattershot bombing. This is a methodical effort to strip away Iran's ability to threaten shipping traffic and regional infrastructure piece by piece, night after night. And that brings us to the detail that changes everything about how seriously this should be taken. It's not just the strikes themselves. It's what's flowing into the region to support them. Multiple B-2 Spirit bombers have been observed departing Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, the B-2's home installation, for staging positions at Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. This is not a small detail. The B-2 is one of the most expensive and limited assets in the entire U.S. arsenal. Each aircraft represents an investment north of $1 billion, and the total operational fleet is small enough that any deployment of multiple airframes to a single forward location is, by itself, a statement. Diego Garcia matters here specifically because of geography. It's close enough to the Persian Gulf to dramatically cut flight time and fuel burden compared to flying B-2s round trip from Missouri, while remaining far enough from Iranian territory to sit outside the effective range of most of Iran's retaliatory missile and drone capability. It is, in blunt terms, a sanctuary base positioned just close enough to strike and just far enough to be safe doing it. But the reason the B-2 specifically matters, more than almost any other airframe in this conflict, comes down to one weapon, the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator. This is a 30,000-pound precision-guided bomb purpose, built to punch through layers of rock, soil, and reinforced concrete before detonating deep underground. The B-2 can carry 2 of these at a time, and it is currently the only aircraft in the U.S. inventory certified to deliver them operationally. That matters enormously in this specific fight, because Iran's most sensitive nuclear and missile infrastructure isn't sitting exposed on the surface, it's buried. Facilities like Fordo were built into mountainsides, specifically because their designers assumed conventional airstrikes could never reach them. The GBU-57, dropped from a B-2, is the one tool in the American arsenal engineered specifically to prove that assumption wrong. When B-2s start massing at a forward base, the message isn't subtle to anyone who understands what that airframe is built to carry. It's a statement that the deepest, most protected sites in Iran are back on the table. Alongside the B-2 buildup, B-1 Lancer bombers have reportedly increased their operational tempo out of RAF Fairford in England, a base that has served as a European staging point for American heavy bombers for years. Fighter assets have also been repositioned. F-16 CJ Wild Weasel aircraft, specialized platforms whose entire mission profile is built around hunting and destroying enemy radar and air defense systems, have been tracked moving into the theater, arriving fresh off transatlantic legs from bases including Spangdahlem in Germany. These aren't general-purpose fighters. Wild Weasels carry the AN/ALQ-213 threat warning and targeting system alongside AGM-88 HARM missiles, weapons specifically designed to home in on the radar emissions of surface-to-air missile batteries the moment those radars power on. Their entire job is to make an enemy's air defense network blind before anything else moves through contested airspace. Pairing Wild Weasels with stealth bombers and F-35 strike fighters isn't a random assortment of hardware, it's a complete kill chain. The Wild Weasels open the door by silencing radar. The F-35s provide additional strike capability and cover, and the B-2s, once the sky is effectively blind to their approach, deliver the payload that ends the argument, particularly against buried targets no other aircraft in the fleet is built to reach. None of this happens by accident, and none of it happens quickly. This is the part most people miss entirely when they watch footage of jets taking off and assume the war is being run improvisationally. Moving a bomber wing, a Wild Weasel squadron, and every support element required to fuel, arm, and maintain them into a forward theater is not a phone call. It's weeks of choreographed logistics. Sealift can move the bulk of heavy equipment, but cargo vessels crossing an ocean at roughly 25 knots take weeks to arrive. Anything considered time critical, instead, moves by air, and that's exactly what's been observed over the past several days. A steady, round-the-clock flow of tanker aircraft, C-17 and C-5 cargo haulers, and fighter squadrons converging on the region. Tankers hold position at altitude in long chains, essentially forming a bridge that keeps everything else topped off and moving. When you see that kind of airlift bridge running continuously, it isn't preparation for a single strike. It's preparation for a sustained campaign, one built to run for as long as it takes. Now let's talk about how Iran has responded, because this is the section that determines where the next 48 to 72 hours are likely headed. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, described his country's guiding doctrine this week in stark terms. An eye for an eye, proportional retaliation, match strike for strike. On its face, that's a familiar posture, the kind of declaratory language regimes under pressure often reach for. But the more consequential response came from the American side. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has been described as signaling that the U.S. response will not be proportional at all, that whatever Iran spends on an attack, the American answer is intended to cost significantly more and is not designed to scale down to match. If accurate, that's not a minor rhetorical distinction. That's Washington explicitly rejecting the tit-for-tat framework Tehran is trying to establish and replacing it with something closer to deliberate, disproportionate consequence. Read that carefully, because it reframes the entire logic of this conflict. A tit-for-tat war has an implicit ceiling. Both sides know roughly what escalation looks like and can calibrate around it. A war where one side has explicitly abandoned proportionality doesn't have that ceiling anymore. And that absence of a ceiling is precisely what keeps serious analysts of this conflict up at night. Iran's response hasn't stayed rhetorical. Iranian-aligned forces have reportedly begun signaling that British military infrastructure, specifically bases like RAF Fairford, that have hosted the B-1 bomber operations, could be considered legitimate targets going forward. The United Kingdom has publicly stated it's prepared to defend itself and its installations at any hour of the day. Whether that threat translates into action remains to be seen, but the fact that a third country's soil is now explicitly part of the target conversation is itself a sign of how far this conflict has already expanded beyond its original geographic footprint. That expansion is visible elsewhere too. Kuwait has reported intercepting hostile missiles and drones on multiple occasions in recent days. Jordan has reported shooting down Iranian-launched missiles targeting its territory, and it was an attack that killed American service members inside Jordan that triggered one of the more recent, sharper waves of U.S. retaliation, strikes explicitly described by U.S. Central Command as intended to swiftly punish Iran for those deaths. Bahrain has sounded air raid sirens. Iran's water desalination strikes against Kuwait, a country almost entirely dependent on desalinated water given its arid geography, left tens of thousands without reliable access, and drew condemnation for targeting civilian infrastructure that has no plausible military justification. This is the pattern to watch closely. Iran's ability to strike back directly at heavily defended American bombers and fighters is limited. What it can do, and has been doing, is widen the map, pulling Gulf states like Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan into the blast radius of a conflict that technically isn't theirs, in an apparent attempt to raise the diplomatic and humanitarian cost of continued American operations without having to match American air power directly. There's also Iran's Houthi allies in Yemen to account for, who have begun making noise about the possibility of threatening the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the secondary choke point that shipping uses to route around the Arabian Peninsula whenever the Strait of Hormuz becomes too dangerous to transit. If that threat becomes real rather than rhetorical, it would represent an attempt to close off the alternative route entirely, leaving global shipping with no safe corridor through the region at all. The United States has already stated it will hold Iran directly accountable for any future Houthi attack on commercial shipping, effectively erasing the distinction between Tehran and its regional proxies for the purposes of retaliation. That's a meaningful shift in itself. It closes off the plausible deniability Iran has traditionally relied on when its allied militias act on its behalf. It helps to understand why the Strait of Hormuz specifically has become the fault line this entire renewed war keeps snapping back to. It's a narrow waterway, at its tightest point only a couple dozen miles wide, separating Iran's southern coast from Oman and the United Arab Emirates. For decades, it has functioned as the single most important oil choke point on the planet, simply because there is no practical substitute for it. Pipelines can carry some volume around the strait, but nowhere near enough to replace what moves by tanker through it on a daily basis. That geography gives Iran a form of leverage that has nothing to do with the size of its economy or the strength of its conventional military. It doesn't need to defeat the United States Navy to matter. It only needs to make transiting the strait unpredictable enough that insurers, shipping companies, and governments start treating the risk as unacceptable. That's the entire logic behind Iran's repeated attempts this year and in prior years to assert control over which vessels move through the strait and under what conditions, and to collect fees from companies willing to pay for safer passage. It's also exactly the leverage the June Memorandum of Understanding was supposed to permanently strip away by reopening the strait to normal international transit and removing Iran's ability to use it as a pressure point. The fact that Iran nonetheless continued asserting hegemonic control over shipping routes even after that agreement was reached is, according to multiple accounts of how the ceasefire unraveled, one of the central reasons the truce collapsed as quickly as it did. That collapse is worth sitting with for a moment because it says something about how fragile any future negotiated pause is likely to be. This is now the second time in roughly 5 months that a ceasefire framework between Washington and Tehran has failed to hold. The first ended with Iran resuming pressure on shipping almost as soon as the guns went quiet. This one ended the same way. That pattern matters enormously for how skeptically any future 10-day pause or any longer negotiated settlement should be read. A ceasefire that removes the underlying incentive structure driving the conflict, in this case, Iran's dependence on coercive control of the strait as a source of revenue and leverage, has a chance of holding. A ceasefire that simply pauses the shooting without resolving that underlying incentive is, based on the last 5 months of evidence, likely to buy weeks at best before the same pressures reassert themselves and pull both sides back into exactly the cycle currently playing out night after night. Now here's where 3 separate pressure tracks are converging on Iran simultaneously, and it's the convergence, not any single track alone, that makes this moment more dangerous than earlier phases of the conflict. The first track is financial. The Strait of Hormuz has functioned for decades as one of Iran's few remaining sources of meaningful leverage and revenue, both through legitimate transit fees and through the coercive fees Iran has attempted to impose on vessels it claims are violating routes and protocols it unilaterally sets. Sustained American strikes on coastal surveillance towers, Fast attack boats and missile batteries along the strait are degrading Iran's ability to project that kind of control at exactly the moment global shipping traffic through the strait has already begun dropping as insurers and shipping companies route around the risk entirely. Every day that traffic stays suppressed is lost revenue Iran cannot easily recover, and a regime under this kind of sustained financial strain has historically far fewer options than one operating from a position of economic stability. The second track is military. 13-plus nights and counting of sustained American strikes have systematically degraded Iran's coastal radar and surveillance network, missile storage infrastructure, drone staging areas, and air defense systems. Iran still retains ballistic missiles, drone stockpiles, and fast attack craft. That much is confirmed by the fact that strikes are still reaching Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan. But retaining a capability and retaining the ability to employ that capability effectively against a systematically blinded air defense network are two very different things. Each night of Wild Weasel and bomber operations chips away at Iran's ability to see American aircraft coming, which in turn makes every subsequent night of strikes incrementally easier and more precise than the one before it. The third track is psychological, and it might be the one doing the most damage of all. A regime under nightly bombardment, watching its senior military infrastructure get systematically dismantled, while simultaneously trying to project strength domestically, is operating under enormous internal strain. There are reports, still difficult to independently verify, that Russia may be providing some degree of targeting assistance to Iranian forces attempting to threaten American troops in the region, a move that would fit Moscow's broader interest in keeping American military and political attention consumed in the Middle East, rather than focused on supporting Ukraine. If accurate, that adds yet another layer of pressure and uncertainty to an already volatile picture, because it raises the possibility, however remote at this stage, of great power friction bleeding into a conflict that started as a regional one. There's a fourth pressure worth understanding in detail, because it's the one that reaches ordinary people far beyond the Persian Gulf, and it's already showing up in markets. When Iranian forces struck tankers in the Strait of Hormuz in mid-July, Brent crude, the global benchmark that ultimately shapes what people pay at the pump on almost every continent, spiked more than 9.5% in a single session, settling above $83 a barrel, its highest level in months. Roughly a fifth of the world's petroleum liquids consumption passes through that strait on any given day in normal conditions. There is no meaningful alternative route that can absorb that volume if the strait becomes too dangerous to transit reliably. Shipping data from earlier in this latest escalation showed more than a dozen commercial vessels still moving through the strait within a single 24-hour window, tankers and cargo ships alike, continuing to run the gauntlet because the alternative, rerouting entirely around the Arabian Peninsula, adds weeks and enormous cost to already strained global supply chains. But that traffic has been thinning as the conflict has dragged on, as insurers price in the risk and shipping companies quietly reroute what they can. Every day this campaign continues is a day where global energy markets are pricing in the possibility that the world's most important oil choke point stops functioning normally, and that's a cost that doesn't stay contained to the region. It shows up in fuel prices, shipping insurance premiums, and the price of nearly everything that has to move by sea, whether the people paying those higher costs have ever thought about the Strait of Hormuz or not. The human cost inside Iran itself is also becoming harder to look away from. Iranian officials have reported that strikes since hostilities resumed in late June have killed dozens and wounded several hundred people, and among the dead and wounded are women and children, according to figures cited by Iranian government spokespeople. Independent verification of exact casualty figures from inside Iran remains difficult, given restricted access for outside journalists, but the pattern described, strikes on desalination infrastructure, on communication and surveillance sites embedded near populated coastal areas, on facilities in provinces like Hormozgan that sit close to civilian population centers, is consistent across multiple independent reporting sources. This is the part that rarely gets the same airtime as footage of jets taking off from European runways, but it's inseparable from any honest accounting of what this campaign is actually costing on both sides of the fight. Regionally, the anxiety is spreading well beyond the two primary combatants. Gulf states that have no direct stake in the underlying dispute between Washington and Tehran are increasingly finding themselves inside the blast radius anyway. Saudi Arabia's tensions with Houthi forces in Yemen have picked up in parallel, adding another layer of instability along the same waterways already under strain from the primary conflict. Diplomats across the region describe watching the pattern of strike and counterstrike settle into something that increasingly looks less like an exchange with a natural endpoint, and more like a structure that has become self-sustaining, where each side's retaliation becomes the justification for the other side's next move, regardless of what either side originally intended when this most recent phase began in early July. It's also worth understanding that this isn't the only active war shaping how Washington is allocating its military and political attention right now. Thousands of miles away, in a completely separate theater, The war in Ukraine continues to grind on, and Ukrainian forces have reportedly scored a notable success in recent days, with an F-16 flown in Ukrainian service credited with its first confirmed air-to-air kill against a Russian fighter. That's a meaningful milestone for Ukraine's Air Force on its own terms. But it also matters here, in the context of Iran, because it's a reminder that American attention, American logistics capacity, and American political bandwidth are not infinite. Every additional bomber wing, every additional squadron of fighters, every additional round of congressional funding directed toward the Iran campaign is implicitly attention and resources not simultaneously available elsewhere. That's precisely the dynamic that has fueled persistent, if difficult to independently confirm, reports that Russia may see strategic value in Iran's continued resistance, and may be providing some degree of support toward that end, on the theory that a United States consumed by a second major war front is a United States with less capacity to sustain its commitments in Eastern Europe. Whether or not that specific claim holds up to full scrutiny, the underlying strategic logic is sound enough that it can't be dismissed outright. All three tracks, financial strangulation, military degradation, and psychological exhaustion, are compounding at the same moment. That's not something that happens by careful design on either side. It's what happens when a ceasefire collapses, and both parties are forced back into active conflict without having resolved any of the underlying grievances that caused the original war. And when all three tracks converge simultaneously, the effect on decision-making inside Tehran is far greater than the sum of the individual parts. That takes us to the command structure question, because understanding who is actually driving decisions inside Iran right now matters as much as understanding the battlefield picture. Iran's supreme leader was killed in the opening strike of this war back in February. That single fact fundamentally altered Iran's internal power structure in ways the outside world is still working to fully map. The formal chain of command still runs through Iran's clerical and political institutions, but the operational reality on the ground is widely understood to run substantially through the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, whose commanders control much of Iran's missile forces, its proxy network across the region, and increasingly its economic interests tied to control of the Strait of Hormuz. Foreign Minister Araghchi represents Iran's diplomatic face to the world, the one issuing statements about proportional retaliation and doctrine. But the actual decisions about when and how to strike, which targets to hit, and how far to push retaliation appear to sit substantially with IRGC commanders whose institutional interests are tied directly to the continuation of exactly the kind of coercive control over shipping lanes that triggered this entire renewed round of conflict in the first place. That's the uncomfortable structural reality underneath the official statements. The people with the clearest institutional incentive to keep this conflict going are not necessarily the same people signing off on ceasefire negotiations, and that gap between nominal diplomatic authority and actual operational control is one of the primary reasons ceasefires in this conflict have proven so fragile. So where does this actually go from here? The honest strategic assessment, stripped of both sides' preferred narrative, looks something like this. The United States currently holds the operational initiative. Its air campaign is degrading Iranian capability night over night. Its logistics pipeline into the region is functioning and expanding. And its political leadership has, at least rhetorically, abandoned the constraint of proportional response in favor of a deliberately disproportionate consequence. Congress has reinforced that posture materially, approving tens of billions of dollars specifically earmarked to fund continued operations, even as a symbolic war powers resolution aimed at ending U.S. involvement passed narrowly in the House before dying in the Senate. That vote matters less for its legislative outcome than for what it reveals. Even in a divided Congress, there was not enough political will to force an end to this campaign, which tells you something about where elite political consensus currently sits. Iran, meanwhile, is attempting to buy time. Reports describe mediators floating a roughly 10-day ceasefire proposal, one that Washington has publicly downplayed the likelihood of accepting. The logic behind Iran seeking any pause, even a short one, is straightforward and has been visible in targeting imagery throughout this campaign. After American strikes hit deeply buried missile bunkers, satellite and reconnaissance imagery has repeatedly shown excavation equipment moving in afterward, used to clear debris, reopen bunker entrances, and allow launchers to be rolled out for use before retreating back underground. A pause in strikes is, functionally, a pause that allows exactly that kind of reconstitution to happen at scale. That's precisely why American excavation clearing equipment observed near these bunker sites has itself become a recurring target in more recent strikes. The campaign isn't just targeting weapons. It's targeting the ability to rebuild and redeploy those weapons. Given all of that, the trajectory over the next several days looks far more likely to trend toward intensification than de-escalation. The hardware currently converging on the region, the B-2s at Diego Garcia, the Wild Weasels arriving fresh from Europe, the tanker bridges running continuously overhead, isn't consistent with a force preparing to stand down. It's consistent with a force building towards something larger than what's already happened over the past 2+ weeks, which is itself already the most intense, sustained American air campaign against Iran since this war first began in February. There's also a domestic political dimension inside the United States that shouldn't be overlooked, because it shapes how much runway this campaign actually has. Congress's decision to approve tens of billions of dollars specifically tied to this operation didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened alongside a competing effort, a war powers resolution aimed at forcing an end to U.S. involvement that passed the House by a narrow margin before dying in the Senate. A resolution like that is largely symbolic. It was never positioned to bind a commander-in-chief who has shown no inclination to treat it as binding regardless. But symbolic votes still function as a kind of pressure gauge. The fact that a meaningful bloc of the House was willing to go on record against continued involvement, even while the funding to sustain that involvement sailed through separately, tells you the political coalition supporting this campaign is not unanimous, even if it remains dominant for now. That gap between funding approval and war powers approval is the kind of thing that tends to widen, not narrow. The longer a campaign drags on without a clear resolution, particularly once American casualties start accumulating at a visible pace, there's one structural risk sitting underneath all of this that deserves to be named directly, because it's the variable that worries serious analysts far more than any single night's target list. It's the fragmentation of command authority on the Iranian side. When a nominal chain of command has been disrupted at its highest level, when operational decision-making has effectively migrated to institutions like the IRGC, whose interests may not fully align with whatever remains of Iran's formal diplomatic leadership, the risk of miscalculation rises sharply. A ceasefire negotiated by one faction can be violated by another faction that was never fully bound by it. A strike intended as calibrated retaliation by field commanders can be interpreted in Washington as an uncontrolled, regime-directed escalation, triggering a response calibrated to that worst-case interpretation rather than to what actually happened on the ground. That gap between what Iran's fragmented command structure actually intends and what the outside world can verify it intended is the single variable most likely to turn an already brutal war of attrition into something that moves faster and further than either side currently plans for. And that brings us back to where we started. A formation of bombers somewhere over an ocean, either arriving or departing. A decision described as close, sitting on a desk in Washington. Fighter squadrons still touching down after transatlantic legs. Tankers still holding their positions at altitude. Logistics chains still running around the clock to keep all of it fed and armed and ready. 13+ nights of strikes have already reshaped what's left of Iran's coastal defenses and missile infrastructure. What comes next? Whether it's an even larger wave of strikes, a fragile pause bought through mediated negotiation, or something that spills further beyond the borders already drawn into this conflict, is still being decided right now, in real time, by people whose full intentions the rest of the world won't fully understand until after they've already acted.